Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Environmental narratives in discourse analysis. Interactive assistant environmental narratives are stories and frameworks through which environmental issues are understood, communicated, and acted upon. These narratives play a significant role in shaping public perceptions of environmental problems, influencing policies, and guiding individual and collective behavior. In discourse analysis, environmental narratives are studied to examine how language constructs stories about nature, climate change, conservation, and sustainability. These narratives can reflect different worldviews, ideologies, and power dynamics, often framing environmental issues in ways that prioritize certain solutions, actors, or values. Discourse analysis of environmental narratives focuses on how language is used to tell stories about the environment, how these stories create meaning, and how they mobilize people or shape policy. By examining political speeches, environmental reports, media coverage, and grassroots campaigns, discourse analysis can reveal how competing narratives are constructed and how they influence public attitudes toward environmental protection, economic growth, and social justice. Key features of environmental narratives in discourse analysis. 1. Framing environmental issues as crises or opportunities. One common feature of environmental narratives is how they frame environmental issues as either a crisis or an opportunity. These narratives shape how the problem is perceived and what kinds of solutions are considered acceptable or urgent. Example: in the narrative of climate change as a crisis, a politician might say, "We are on the brink of environmental collapse if we don't act now." This narrative emphasizes urgency and catastrophe, encouraging immediate action. In contrast, a corporation might frame environmental challenges as an opportunity with language like, "The transition to clean energy presents a unique chance for innovation and economic growth." Discourse analysis would explore how these two frames shape different policy responses and mobilize distinct audiences. 2. Hero-villain-victim structure. Many environmental narratives follow a hero-villain-victim structure, where certain actors, e.g., governments, corporations, communities, are cast in moral roles. Discourse analysis looks at how this structure assigns blame, responsibility, and power within environmental stories. Example: in a campaign against deforestation, environmental groups might cast indigenous communities as the victims of logging, corporations as the villains responsible for environmental degradation, and activists or governments as the heroes trying to protect the forests. Discourse analysis would examine how these roles are constructed and how they influence public opinion and policy toward deforestation. 3. Nature as a fragile victim or a resilient force. Environmental narratives often portray nature in one of two contrasting ways: as a fragile entity needing protection or as a resilient force capable of recovering if left undisturbed. Discourse analysis explores how these portrayals shape the way humans interact with the environment and justify conservation efforts or exploitation. Example: conservation organizations might use language like, "Our ecosystems are on the verge of collapse and need urgent protection," portraying nature as fragile. On the other hand, a narrative promoting sustainable resource use might frame nature as resilient, using phrases like, "Nature has the ability to heal if we practice sustainable management." Discourse analysis would explore how these narratives shape attitudes toward conservation, resource extraction, or policy initiatives. 4. Environmental justice and social equity. Environmental justice narratives focus on how environmental degradation disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, and how solutions must address both ecological and social inequities. Discourse analysis examines how language reflects these concerns and how environmental narratives intersect with issues of race, class, and power. Example: in environmental justice movements, a narrative might center on language like, "Low-income communities and communities of color are bearing the brunt of pollution and climate change impacts." Discourse analysis would investigate how this narrative connects environmental degradation with systemic social inequalities, promoting a holistic view of environmental action that includes social justice. 5. Apocalyptic versus optimistic narratives. Some environmental narratives take an apocalyptic tone, emphasizing destruction and irreversible harm, while others offer a more optimistic outlook, focusing on solutions, hope, and human ingenuity. Discourse analysis looks at how these contrasting narratives affect public engagement with environmental issues. Example: apocalyptic narratives might use phrases like, "We are headed toward an extinction-level event if we do nothing," emphasizing fear and catastrophe to spur action. Optimistic narratives might use language such as, "Together, we can build a sustainable future," offering hope and collective responsibility. Discourse analysis would explore how these narratives impact individual behaviors, policy support, or public engagement. 6. Sustainability and corporate narratives. In corporate discourse, sustainability is often framed in ways that align with business interests, presenting companies as leaders in the fight against environmental degradation. Corporate environmental narratives can range from sincere commitments to sustainability to greenwashing tactics aimed at improving public image. Example: a company might publish a report stating, "We are dedicated to reducing our carbon footprint while continuing to provide innovative products to our customers." Discourse analysis would examine how the narrative balances corporate interests with environmental responsibility and how it frames the company's role as a leader in sustainable practices. 7. Global versus local environmental narratives. Environmental narratives can also differ in their scale. Some focus on global environmental issues like climate change, while others emphasize local concerns such as pollution in specific communities. Discourse analysis investigates how the scale of environmental narratives influences the solutions that are proposed and the actors involved. Example: global environmental narratives might focus on statements like, "The fight against climate change requires international cooperation and collective action," while local narratives might focus on more immediate concerns, such as, "Our community must come together to clean up the river." Discourse analysis would explore how these different scales shape the framing of environmental problems and the proposed solutions. Methods for analyzing environmental narratives in discourse. 1. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis examines how stories about the environment are constructed and how different actors, governments, corporations, activists, use these stories to influence perceptions and behavior. This method looks at the structure of the narrative, the roles assigned to various actors, and the underlying themes. Example: an environmental NGO might construct a narrative of saving endangered species from extinction, using language that portrays conservation efforts as urgent and morally just. Narrative analysis would explore how this storytelling fosters emotional engagement and builds support for conservation policies. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis investigates how environmental narratives highlight certain aspects of an issue while downplaying others. This method is used to understand how different stakeholders frame environmental challenges and solutions, influencing public perceptions and policy choices. Example: in the debate over renewable energy, one side might frame it as a solution to the climate crisis and a boost for green jobs, while opponents frame it as an expensive, unreliable alternative to traditional energy. Frame analysis would examine how these competing narratives shape public opinion and political decision-making. 3. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, explores how environmental narratives reflect power dynamics and ideologies. CDA focuses on how dominant narratives may marginalize certain voices, such as indigenous communities or low-income populations, and how language reinforces or challenges these power structures. Example: in government discourse around land use, a CDA might reveal that environmental narratives prioritize economic development over conservation, using language like sustainable development to justify land exploitation. The analysis would focus on how this narrative marginalizes conservationist and indigenous perspectives. 4. Ecolinguistics. Ecolinguistics is an approach that examines how language reflects ecological values, and how narratives about nature and the environment influence human relationships with the natural world. This method focuses on the cultural and ecological implications of environmental discourse. Example: ecolinguistics might analyze how terms like natural resources frame nature as something to be exploited, while phrases like living ecosystems promote a more holistic, interconnected view of the environment. The analysis would explore how these different narratives affect societal attitudes toward environmental conservation. Examples of environmental narratives in discourse analysis. Example 1. Climate change as a moral imperative. In political discourse, a leader might frame climate change as a moral issue, saying, "We have a responsibility to future generations to take action now." Discourse analysis would explore how this narrative appeals to ethics and intergenerational justice, framing environmental action as a moral obligation rather than just a political or economic decision. Example 2. Corporate greenwashing in sustainability reports. A multinational company might publish a sustainability report stating, "Our goal is to be carbon neutral by 2030, while simultaneously engaging in environmentally harmful practices. Discourse analysis would investigate how the company uses the narrative of sustainability to enhance its public image while minimizing discussion of ongoing environmental impacts. Example 3. Indigenous narratives in conservation. An indigenous group might use language like, "We are the guardians of the land, protecting it for future generations," framing their relationship with the environment as one of stewardship. Discourse analysis would examine how this narrative contrasts with dominant conservation narratives that often exclude indigenous voices and practices. Example 4. Media coverage of deforestation. Media outlets might frame deforestation in the Amazon as a global crisis, or as a necessary trade-off for economic development. Discourse analysis would explore how these competing narratives influence public perception of deforestation, and how they reflect different values, ecological preservation versus economic growth. Example 5. Environmental activism and protest narratives. An environmental activist group might adopt a narrative of resistance against corporate greed, using language like, "We are fighting to stop big oil from destroying our planet." Discourse analysis would examine how this narrative frames the issue as a battle between ordinary citizens and powerful corporations, mobilizing public support for direct action. Challenges in analyzing environmental narratives through discourse. 1. Competing narratives. Environmental issues are often subject to competing narratives that reflect different values, interests, and ideologies. Discourse analysts must navigate these conflicting stories to understand how they shape public opinion and policy, while recognizing the power imbalances that may privilege certain narratives over others. 2. Scientific complexity. Many environmental narratives involve complex scientific data and predictions, which can be difficult to translate into compelling or accessible narratives. Discourse analysts must consider how scientific language is simplified or misrepresented in public discourse. 3. Cultural differences. Environmental narratives often vary across different cultures and regions, reflecting local concerns, values, and relationships with nature. Discourse analysts must be sensitive to these cultural variations and avoid generalizing findings across diverse contexts. Conclusion. Environmental narratives play a crucial role in shaping how individuals, communities, and governments understand and respond to environmental challenges. Through discourse analysis, researchers can explore how language constructs stories about climate change, conservation, sustainability, and environmental justice, revealing the values, power dynamics, and ideologies embedded in these narratives. By examining political speeches, corporate reports, media coverage, and activist campaigns, discourse analysis uncovers how competing environmental narratives influence public perception, mobilize action, and shape policy decisions. Understanding the role of environmental narratives in discourse is essential for addressing the complex and interconnected challenges of environmental protection and sustainability. Frequently asked questions. What are environmental narratives in discourse analysis? Environmental narratives are the stories and frameworks used to communicate, interpret, and act on environmental issues. Discourse analysis examines how these narratives are constructed, what language is used, and how they shape public perception and policy. How do environmental narratives frame issues as crises or opportunities? Environmental issues can be framed as crises, emphasizing urgency and catastrophe, e.g., we are on the brink of disaster, or as opportunities, e.g., the shift to green energy is an economic growth chance. These frames guide how problems are perceived and what solutions are considered. What is the hero-villain-victim structure in environmental narratives? This structure assigns moral roles in environmental stories, where actors such as activists or governments become heroes, corporations or polluters are cast as villains, and communities or nature are depicted as victims. Discourse analysis examines how these roles affect public perception and policy. How are narratives about nature constructed in environmental discourse? Nature is often portrayed as fragile and needing protection, e.g., our forests are disappearing, or as resilient and capable of recovery, e.g., nature can heal if managed sustainably. These portrayals influence conservation policies and public attitudes. What is the role of environmental justice in narratives? Environmental justice narratives highlight how environmental degradation disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Language in these narratives emphasizes equity and social responsibility, connecting ecological concerns with social issues like race and class. How do apocalyptic and optimistic narratives differ in impact? Apocalyptic narratives emphasize catastrophe and irreversible harm, potentially inducing fear and urgency, e.g., we are facing an extinction-level event. Optimistic narratives focus on solutions and hope, e.g., we can build a sustainable future together, fostering engagement and action. Discourse analysis explores how these contrasting narratives shape public behavior and policy support. How are corporate sustainability efforts examined in discourse analysis? Corporate sustainability narratives can reflect genuine environmental commitments or greenwashing tactics aimed at enhancing public image. Discourse analysis scrutinizes how language in corporate reports frames sustainability efforts, revealing if they align with actual practices. How do global and local environmental narratives differ? Global narratives emphasize worldwide cooperation, e.g., the fight against climate change is global, while local narratives address specific community concerns, e.g., we need to clean up our river. These scales affect proposed solutions and the involvement of various actors. What methods are used to analyze environmental narratives? Narrative analysis focuses on story structures and themes. Frame analysis explores how aspects of an issue are highlighted or downplayed. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines power dynamics and whose voices are privileged. Ecolinguistics looks at language's ecological implications and its influence on human-nature relationships. What are the challenges in analyzing environmental narratives? Challenges include navigating competing narratives with different ideological underpinnings, translating complex scientific information into accessible discourse, and accounting for cultural variations in how environmental stories are told and understood.